To see how prison gangs work, look at the movie Rise of the Planet of the Apes.
Caesar's in prison, and he does two things. Makes the rival ape submit to his authority. That is a real first step in the rise of prison gangs. But then he does another interesting thing. He actually teaches his former rival, he gives him the cookies and tells him to go distribute the cookies. And all of a sudden, the other apes are looking at Caesar and saying, wow, this guy's not selfish. That's what gangs do. That's the source of their power.
Whether it's apes or humans, prison gangs are a fact of life in prisons around the world. But could some prisons actually need them?
These gangs have been helpful for the institution itself.
They kind of create a protection.
And how have mass incarceration policies created the criminal juggernauts we see today?
They are always looking out for whatever criminal activity can make them money.
Sell drugs, they do contract killings, they run criminal enterprises that reach outside the prison walls. But just who are these people?
Prison gangs are criminal organizations that form in prison. And they're more recent than you might think. Before the 1950s, prisons in California were small. Prisoners had a set of rules they lived by. It was known as the convict code.
So the convict code refers to this kind of informal behavioral code. These would be basic things like respect for people who've been there the longest, not informing on each other.
But from the 1950s, prison populations in California started to grow dramatically. With so many new faces who didn't know the code, it started to fail.
There's this kind of rush of new people into the facility. They're not necessarily reliant on the support or the blessing of the lifers in the facility at the time.
With no one following the code, violence between prisoners erupted. Inmates needed to organize protection for themselves, so they formed gangs.
Many of these groups describe their own origin stories in these kind of defensive terms.
You have these just almost institutions in South America and California, you know, the Mexican mafia or whatever it might be, and it's described it as a family.
Gang members didn't just keep each other safe, they also imposed rules. Prison gang rules replaced the code and restored order. In California, between 1973 and 2003, as the number of prison gangs and gang members was going up, the rate of inmate homicides fell by 94%.
I think a lot of the residents of prison facilities often, in some ways, can see prison gangs as helpful in terms of feeling like they have some sort of like protective element while they're incarcerated.
But the prison gangs didn't stop at protection. They soon moved into business.
All of these drugs were found inside Solano prison, some smuggled in by visitors.
Everything that came into prison was what was controlled by the Mexican mafia.
Prisons are awash with contraband. And like any other market, contraband markets work better when someone enforces the rules.
Controlling contraband markets has become, across most if not all of these groups, the primary function or goal.
In American prisons, fights mean lockdowns, which means no chance to deal drugs or other contraband. So it's in the gang's interests to prevent violence.
Part of the role that some of these groups have is through kind of refereeing disputes.
Elsewhere, prisoners don't just need protection from each other, they also need protection from the guards. For decades in Brazilian prisons, torture at the hands of guards and abuse of human rights were commonplace.
These were dungeons, and they were places where guard abuse was rampant and common. Food was barely edible. People were very isolated. Their families couldn't visit them.
In the 1970s, Brazil's first prison gang, or faction, was born out of these hellish conditions. The Comando Vermelho.
Comando Vermelho was the first criminal collective, as we usually call them here in Brazil. They were initially a collective of prisoners that organized themselves as a social movement to demand better conditions of imprisonment towards the prison administrations.
The model worked. In the 90s, another faction was born, this time in a Sao Paulo prison. Primeiro Comando de Capital, or PCC, formed to defend inmates in the wake of a massacre perpetrated by guards. Now, it dominates an estimated 85% of Sao Paulo's prisons.
In the prisons controlled by factions, they punish the prison administration by threatening the families of the prison administrators in case they exceed in their punishments or if they practice tortures. So the factions have some possibility of bargaining through violent threat.
As in California, Brazilian prison gangs have reduced prisoner-on-prisoner violence.
They put in place their governance structures, and then once they've done that, what's the state going to do, right? Suddenly you've got this Comando Vermelho or this PCC, and they're saying, hey, we've got this. We're going to figure out how to run this up. We're going to make sure nobody kills anybody else or steals from anybody else or rapes anybody else. Once the gangs start governing, it's natural for the state to kind of withdraw.
And thanks to colossal prison populations, these gangs are now huge.
Nowadays, Comando Vermelho and Primeiro Comando da Capital are the greatest factions, large criminal organizations that have influence all over the country.
In fact, they've got so big, they've expanded well beyond prison walls. In 1999, something extraordinary started happening in Sao Paulo. The murder rate, one of the highest in any city in the world, started to fall dramatically. By 2015, it had fallen by 80%, and it was down to the PCC.
PCC was influencing the interactions between criminals outside prison walls.
Having outgrown Sao Paulo's prisons, the PCC took over drug dealing in the favelas. Now all drug dealers worked for the same gang. This meant less fighting over turf. Reducing violence is good for business, but police scrutiny isn't. So the gang decided to do something about that as well.
If you think about it, some things could happen in the favela that the police are going to have to come in no matter what. So while you're at it, why don't you also prohibit violence and rape in the favela? And if it happens, you go and punish the culprit so that the police don't have to come in.
And it's not just the PCC. Comando Vermelho now vies for control of neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro with other factions. In the northeast, Al-Qaeda, another prison gang, have brought a type of peace to favelas in Parabia. They also make rap videos.
Sou o mago do facão. Pensamento eloquente me leva a mais aviso. O poder do crime fica cada vez mais infinito.
Brazil's policy of mass incarceration has produced a new kind of gang. One born in prison that values strict adherence to rules and order. And it also provides a steady flow of new recruits.
You sort of sweep up these youth and in prison. Well, what happens if the prison where you put them is run by Comando Vermelho or PCC or Mara Salvatrucha? Once they get to prison, they depend on that gang for safety.
They end up declaring themselves as a member of one of these organizations.
When prison gangs are big enough and organized enough, they can sometimes reduce violence. But when they're too small or too loosely organized, problems start.
Britain, we're talking specifically here in England and Wales, really doesn't have the kind of gang culture that we have in California and South America. The reason for that is our prisons are much smaller and much more dispersed across the country.
Prisoners in England and Wales are moved around a lot more, often breaking up potential gangs before they start.
We have more informal groupings, and so while we don't have those mass gangs that are almost, in charge of areas of cities and prisons themselves in South America, what we do have is in big cities like Liverpool and Manchester, Birmingham especially, you get gangs members who end up in prison because of their criminal behaviour, who then continue the work of that of the same criminal gang.
Prison gangs have only recently hit the news in the UK. Their power rising as English prisons become more overcrowded and understaffed. But like Brazil and California, English prison gangs, or OCGs, organised crime groups, are helped to flourish in part by complicit prison officers.
We've seen an increase in the number of prison officers who have been dismissed for gross misconduct because of things like corruption, smuggling in illicit contraband. It's hard to know whether that is an increase in the actual corruption or it's whether an increase in detection. Or OCGs will target prison officers and their families to blackmail them into complicity.
Gangs in themselves don't make prisons less violent, as English prisons show. But when it comes to mass incarceration, they can sometimes help.
There's a kind of a moment of violence while they're eliminating all their rivals, but once that's over, prison violence falls. You know, is this on balance a good thing? That's a very difficult question.